In the spring of 1834, in the rolling hills of central Virginia, a discovery was made that would permanently alter our understanding of the depths of human cruelty. 47 children, ranging in age from 6 to 16, were found chained inside a basement beneath what appeared to be an ordinary farmhouse. The children looked nothing alike, spoke different languages, and when questioned, could only whisper a single name through their tears: Mother Sullivan. A local sheriff's report, hidden for more than a century in the Henry County archives, described scenes so horrifying that 3 of the officers involved resigned within a week. What makes the case especially disturbing is not only what was uncovered, but the realization that Constance Sullivan had carried out her operation for more than 20 years without being discovered. The children referred to her as Mother. But the truth behind that title was far darker than anyone could have imagined. Before continuing with the story of the Sullivan family and their unspeakable secrets, I want to ask you something important. This channel is not for everyone. It is meant only for those brave enough to confront the darkest chapters of American history. If you've made it this far, you are not like most people. You understand that some truths are too disturbing to ignore. So, hit the subscribe button and join our community of true mystery seekers. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? Are you brave enough to hear stories like this from your own backyard? The question that haunted investigators then, and still troubles historians today, is how such a large operation could have remained hidden for so long in a close-knit rural community. Virginia in 1834 was caught between 2 eras. The plantation system still shaped daily life, while early signs of industrial change drifted down from the north. Within this setting, the small farming community of Millbrook, home to perhaps 50 families spread across the gentle hills of Henry County, represented a typical rural American settlement of the time. Most residents grew tobacco or corn, traded at Henderson's General Store, and gathered at a one-room schoolhouse that also served as a community meeting hall. The Sullivan property sat on the outskirts of Millbrook, a modest 2-story wooden farmhouse, surrounded by nearly 200 acres of fertile farmland. To travelers along the dusty road connecting Millbrook to Richmond, the farm appeared completely ordinary. Built in the Federal style popular in the 1810s, the house featured white, painted clapboard siding and a wraparound porch common in Virginia architecture. A red barn stood about 60 yards behind the house, with a chicken coop and smokehouse completing the typical farm layout. What set the Sullivan property apart could not be seen from the road. Ezra Sullivan, who purchased the land in 1809 using money inherited from his father's tobacco fortune, devoted significant effort to expanding the home's basement. While most Virginia homes of the era had simple root cellars, the Sullivan basement extended far beyond the footprint of the house above. Local craftsmen recalled being hired for excavation work throughout the 1810s and 1820s, though none ever saw the project completed. Ezra paid generously and always in cash, asking only that workers focus on their assigned areas rather than the entire construction. Constance Sullivan, Ezra's wife, arrived in Millbrook in 1811 as a 22-year-old bride. Neighbors remembered her as an attractive woman with dark hair and a notably soft voice. She dressed plainly, but neatly, attended Methodist church services when her health allowed, and was known for her charitable nature. When asked to contribute to community causes, Constance would explain that she and Ezra were already caring for several orphaned children from her family in Pennsylvania. She described the situation as temporary, lasting only until permanent homes could be found. This explanation satisfied the community's curiosity about the occasional sight of children on the Sullivan property. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store, sometimes noticed a child's face peering from the Sullivan wagon when Constance came to town for supplies. The children never spoke, but Constance would explain that they were shy, traumatized by the loss of their parents, and needed time to adjust. In an era marked by high mortality rates and widespread orphanhood, the community accepted these explanations without suspicion. Thomas Henderson later recalled that Constance Sullivan was one of his most dependable customers. Every 2 weeks, she arrived with a detailed list and enough cash to purchase large quantities of basic food supplies flour, cornmeal, salt, pork, molasses, and other staples. The amount seemed excessive for a couple without children, but when Thomas commented on it, Constance reminded him of the orphans. She also bought unusually large amounts of basic medicines, explaining that children from impoverished backgrounds often arrived sick and in need of treatment. The Sullivan farm followed a routine that puzzled some neighbors. While most farming families rose at dawn and worked until sunset, activity at the Sullivan property often continued late into the night. Lights burned in the farmhouse windows at odd hours, and the sound of hammering or construction occasionally carried across the fields after dark. When questioned, Ezra explained that he was making improvements to accommodate the growing number of children in their care. Marcus Whitfield, the traveling physician who served the Millbrook area, recalled being summoned to the Sullivan farm several times during the 1820s and early 1830s. On each visit, he was told that one of the orphaned children had fallen ill and required medical care. However, Dr. Whitfield was never allowed to examine any of the children himself. Instead, Constance described their symptoms and requested specific medicines. When the doctor pressed to see his patients, Constance insisted the children were too frightened of strangers and too deeply traumatized to endure an examination by an unfamiliar man. The deception was so convincing that even the local pastor, Reverend Samuel Matthews, believed fully in the Sullivan family's charitable efforts. During his occasional visits to the farm, Reverend Matthews praised Constance and Ezra for their Christian compassion in caring for so many unfortunate children. He offered his assistance in finding permanent homes for the orphans, but Constance always explained that she was already corresponding with relatives in Pennsylvania who would eventually take them in. She assured him that the process simply required patience and careful planning. What no one in the community realized was that Constance Sullivan had been refining her deception for more than 20 years. The orphan children were not temporary residents waiting to be placed with loving families. They were captives, purchased, kidnapped, or lured away from their homes across multiple states and held in conditions that would horrify even hardened criminals. The events that would finally expose the Sullivan family's secrets began with a series of seemingly unrelated incidents in the early months of 1834. February had been unusually severe, with temperatures dropping far below freezing for weeks. The brutal cold that gripped Virginia that winter proved both a blessing and a curse for the 47 children trapped beneath the Sullivan farmhouse. On February 23, 1834, a traveling merchant named Jacob Stern was journeying from Richmond to Charlottesville when a violent snowstorm forced him to seek shelter. The Sullivan farm, the nearest building visible from the road, appeared to be his only option. Ezra Sullivan, though clearly reluctant, could not refuse hospitality to a stranded traveler in such dangerous conditions. Stern later described the night as deeply uncomfortable. Constance Sullivan served a simple meal of cornbread and salt pork, but the conversation was strained and uneasy. The Sullivans appeared nervous, exchanging constant glances and reacting sharply to every sound. When Stern asked about the children he had been told lived on the farm, Constance explained that they were all asleep and must not be disturbed. She claimed the children had been suffering from fevers and needed rest. What troubled Stern most was the noise. As he lay on a makeshift bed in the parlor that night, he heard what sounded like muffled crying coming from beneath the floor. When he mentioned this to Ezra the following morning, Sullivan dismissed it as wind passing through gaps in the foundation, a common occurrence in old houses during cold weather. Stern accepted the explanation, though something about the Sullivans' behavior continued to unsettle him. The second incident occurred 3 weeks later, on March 15. Mary Catherine Flynn, a young Irish immigrant traveling with her family in search of work in the tobacco fields near Richmond, became separated from them during a river crossing. Exhausted and frightened, she eventually made her way to the Sullivan farm. As night fell, Constance Sullivan took her in, offering food and shelter. Mary Catherine was never seen alive again. When her family reported her missing to the sheriff in Richmond, they described her last known location and the direction in which she had been traveling. A search party was organized, but the vast Virginia wilderness made locating a single missing person nearly impossible. After a week, the search was abandoned, and Mary Catherine Flynn was presumed to have died from exposure or been killed by wild animals. The final incident leading to the discovery occurred on April 2, 1834. William Hutchinson, a local farmer, was hunting rabbits in the woods bordering the Sullivan property when he heard something that froze him in place. From somewhere near the farmhouse came the sound of children screaming, not playful cries, but raw, desperate shrieks of terror. Hutchinson cautiously moved closer, concealing himself behind a stand of oak trees about 50 yards from the house. For nearly an hour, he watched and listened. The screaming continued intermittently, always seeming to come from beneath the house rather than inside it. At one point, he saw Ezra Sullivan emerge from what appeared to be a cellar door along the side of the house. Ezra looked around nervously before disappearing back underground. When Hutchinson reported what he had seen to his neighbors, reactions were mixed. Some suggested the orphaned children might be more troubled than the Sullivans had admitted, possibly requiring discipline or medical treatment that could be distressing to witness. Others began recalling details that had once seemed insignificant: the unusually large quantities of food Constance purchased, the strange nighttime noises, and the fact that none of the supposed orphans had ever been seen in town or at community gatherings. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, a seasoned lawman who had served Henrico County for more than 15 years, initially dismissed the concerns as mere neighborhood gossip. However, when William Hutchinson confronted him directly and demanded to file a formal complaint, Crawford agreed to look into the matter. By law, he was required to investigate reports of possible child abuse, regardless of his personal doubts about the accusations. On the morning of April 8, 1834, Sheriff Crawford rode out to the Sullivan farm with his deputy, Marcus Webb. They arrived shortly after sunrise, expecting a routine visit that would quiet the rumors circulating through the community. Constance Sullivan greeted them at the door, calm and hospitable. She invited the officers inside for coffee and expressed concern about the gossip spreading among the neighbors. The discussion began ordinarily enough. Constance once again explained the situation with the orphaned children, showed the officers letters she claimed were from relatives in Pennsylvania, and offered to arrange a meeting between the children and Sheriff Crawford once they recovered from a recent illness. Everything appeared reasonable until Deputy Webb asked to use the privy. As Webb walked around the side of the house, he noticed something that chilled him. The cellar door William Hutchinson had previously seen Ezra Sullivan using was secured with 3 padlocks. Heavy chains wrapped around the handles, and the wood surrounding the locks bore marks of frantic clawing, as though someone had tried to scratch their way out from inside. When Webb returned and quietly informed Sheriff Crawford of what he had seen, both men understood that this was no longer a matter of idle gossip. Crawford calmly asked Constance to show them the cellar, explaining that a thorough inspection would help settle the rumors. Her reaction was immediate and unsettling. Her face drained of color, her hands began to shake, and she stumbled through explanations about the cellar being dangerous, insisting the children were forbidden to go down there and that it contained nothing but old equipment and storage. That was when they heard it. From beneath their feet came the sound of children crying, followed by a faint voice pleading for help. Though muffled, the noise was unmistakable, rising directly from beneath the kitchen floor, where they stood. The aftermath of that first discovery would haunt Sheriff Crawford for the rest of his life. When he and Deputy Webb forced open the cellar door, a wave of stench poured out of the darkness below, a combination of human waste, unwashed bodies, and something Crawford would later describe as the smell of despair itself. The basement Ezra Sullivan had spent more than 20 years constructing was a carefully designed chamber of cruelty. The main room extended far beyond the footprint of the house above, tunneling into the earth like an underground maze. Stone walls, carefully mortared to muffle sound, formed a network of connected chambers. The largest room, directly beneath the kitchen, held most of the children. They were chained to iron rings set into the stone walls, shackles locked around their ankles. The chains allowed only limited movement, offering no chance of escape. The children ranged in age from approximately 6 to 16. They were severely undernourished, dressed in rags, their bodies marked by prolonged neglect and abuse. Many suffered from illness, fevers, breathing difficulties, and skin diseases caused by damp, airless conditions underground. What struck both officers most deeply was the silence. After the initial cries for help, the children said nothing. They only stared at the strangers with eyes devoid of hope or expectation. Deputy Webb, a father of 4, had to leave the basement twice to vomit. Sheriff Crawford, despite his years in law enforcement, struggled to comprehend the scale of what lay before him. The deliberate planning, the long-term imprisonment, and the sheer number of victims exceeded anything he had ever encountered. In the smaller chambers, Crawford and Webb uncovered evidence of the Sullivan system of control. One room contained stocks and restraining devices used for punishment. Another served as a crude medical area where injuries and illnesses were treated, not out of care, but to keep the children alive and usable. A third chamber held detailed records that would become vital to the investigation: names, ages, arrival dates, and notes describing each child's condition and behavior. These records revealed the extent of the operation. Children had been brought to the farm regularly since 1812. Shortly after Constance Sullivan arrived in Millbrook, some were orphans purchased from overcrowded poorhouses. Others were runaways lured with promises of food and shelter, while some appeared to have been taken directly from their families. Over the years, more than 90 children had passed through the Sullivan basement. The question of what had happened to the others was answered in the most horrific way imaginable. In a separate chamber, reached through a narrow passage that required crawling, Crawford and Webb discovered the remains of at least 36 children. Some appeared to have died from illness or starvation, while others showed signs of violence. All had been buried in shallow graves beneath the basement floor, their bodies covered with lime to suppress odor and decay. The investigation that followed would continue for months as authorities tried to understand how such an extensive criminal operation had gone undetected for more than 20 years. The answer lay in Constance Sullivan's mastery of deception and her deep understanding of human psychology. She had constructed a public persona almost perfectly suited to avoid suspicion in a rural community of the 1830s. The image of a charitable woman caring for orphaned children aligned seamlessly with the community's Christian values and conveniently explained any unusual aspects of life on the Sullivan farm. Her story of traumatized children too fearful to interact with strangers accounted for why the orphans were never seen in public. Claims that permanent placements were being arranged with distant relatives explained why the children never appeared to leave the property. Even more strategically, Constance had built multiple layers of protection around her operation. The children were trained to call her mother, ensuring that anyone who overheard them would assume a normal family bond. On the rare occasions outsiders caught sight of the children, they had been carefully instructed to remain silent and appear shy rather than frightened. The large food purchases were justified by the presence of many children, while the medical supplies were explained away as necessities for sickly orphans. The physical design of the operation was equally deliberate. Construction of the basement had been carried out gradually over many years, with different workers assigned to separate tasks. No single craftsman ever saw the entire layout or understood the true purpose of the alterations. The soundproofing was effective enough that even nearby neighbors seldom heard anything alarming, and when they did, the noises could be dismissed as ordinary farm sounds or the normal activity of children at play. Perhaps the most disturbing element was the psychological system of control Constance had developed. The children were told they had been abandoned, that no one was searching for them, and that the outside world was dangerous and cruel. Those who complied were rewarded with slightly better food and living conditions. Those who resisted were punished in ways meant to serve as warnings to the others. Over time, many of the children came to accept their captivity as the natural state of their lives. The community's response to the discovery was one of utter shock and disbelief. Many residents initially refused to accept that Constance Sullivan, the quiet woman who had lived among them for more than 20 years, could be responsible for such horrors. Some claimed she must have been manipulated by her husband, while others insisted the situation had been misunderstood. These explanations collapsed as further evidence came to light. The records recovered from the basement contained not only detailed information about the children, but also correspondence with criminal contacts in other states. Constance Sullivan had been part of a child trafficking network that bought and sold victims across state lines. The Sullivan farm was only one part of a much larger operation stretching from Pennsylvania to Georgia. As Sheriff Crawford continued his investigation, troubling patterns emerged that suggested a level of organization far beyond what had first been assumed. Letters found in the basement showed that Constance had maintained regular contact with at least 12 individuals across 5 states, all apparently involved in similar activities. Written in a simple code that was later deciphered, the correspondence discussed deliveries and quality control in language that clearly referred to human trafficking. One letter, dated just 3 months before the discovery and signed only by a man named Morrison in Philadelphia, stated that he had 6 new items of varying ages and conditions suitable for her needs. The letter included descriptions of the children, their approximate ages, physical health, and, most disturbingly, notes on their temperaments indicating which were compliant and which would require additional training. The financial records revealed an even more horrifying reality. Constance Sullivan paid between $50 and $200 per child, depending on age and condition. She also received payments from other locations, suggesting that the farm functioned both as a destination and a redistribution point for trafficked children. Over 2 decades, the transactions totaled more than $8,000, a staggering sum for the time, equivalent to several $100,000 today. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the traveling physician who had visited the Sullivan farm on multiple occasions, became a key witness as the investigation widened. Under questioning, he revealed that Constance had always been unusually precise about the medications she requested. She possessed detailed knowledge of treating malnutrition, respiratory infections, and other ailments common among severely neglected children. She also requested sedatives and other substances that could be used to control uncooperative prisoners. This testimony led to another chilling conclusion. Constance Sullivan had been systematically studying how to keep large numbers of children alive under conditions of extreme deprivation. The medicines she purchased, the questions she asked, and even the design of the basement were all intended to maximize survival while minimizing the resources needed to sustain her captives. Local businessman Thomas Henderson provided further confirmation. A review of his sales records showed that Constance Sullivan had steadily increased her purchases of basic supplies over the years. What appeared to be the increasing needs of a charitable household was, in reality, evidence of a growing criminal operation. Henderson also recalled specific requests that had seemed odd at the time: extra blankets, large amounts of children's clothing, and bulk purchases of basic medicines. The investigation also uncovered Ezra Sullivan's role in the operation. While Constance appeared to be the architect behind it all, Ezra was responsible for maintaining the physical structure of the prison and controlling the children. Several survivors later described him as the enforcer who carried out punishments and imposed discipline. His work on the basement had not simply been expansion, but the continual refinement of a system designed to keep human beings confined. The most disturbing revelation came from examining the records of children who had vanished from the Sullivan farm over the years. The ledgers showed that some children had been transferred to other locations, indicating a network of buyers and sellers operating across multiple states. Others were marked as unsuitable or problematic, entries that matched the remains discovered in the basement burial chamber. As authorities began coordinating with officials in other states, the scope of the investigation widened. Reports of missing children from Pennsylvania, Maryland, North Carolina, and South Carolina revealed unsettling similarities. Many of the missing matched the profiles of the children found at the Sullivan farm: poor, orphaned, or from families without the means to conduct extensive searches. Federal marshals were brought in to oversee the multi-state investigation, an unprecedented step for the era, as law enforcement was typically confined to local jurisdictions. The Sullivan case became one of the earliest major criminal investigations to cross state lines and involve federal authorities. Legal complications arose due to the crimes spanning multiple jurisdictions governed by different laws. As the weeks passed, more survivors began sharing their experiences. Their accounts were strikingly consistent, describing years of imprisonment, systematic abuse, and psychological manipulation. They explained how new arrivals were broken down through isolation, punishment, and indoctrination until they accepted their captivity. They also described a hierarchy among the prisoners, with older children granted small privileges in exchange for helping control younger ones. Survivors revealed the extent of Constance Sullivan's psychological manipulation. She convinced many children that they were worthless, that their families had abandoned or sold them, and that they deserved their suffering. Some of the older children, held captive for years, initially resisted rescue efforts because they had been conditioned to believe the outside world was more dangerous than their imprisonment. The investigation also uncovered Constance's methods for acquiring victims. She had formed relationships with corrupt officials at poorhouses and orphanages who supplied children in exchange for payment. She also relied on contacts within criminal circles in major cities who identified vulnerable targets, runaways, street orphans, and children unlikely to be immediately missed. Most chilling of all, the records showed that the operation had been expanding in recent years. The number of children held had increased, and correspondence revealed plans to establish similar facilities elsewhere. The discovery at the Sullivan farm appeared to have halted a criminal enterprise on the verge of significant expansion. The breakthrough that ultimately exposed the full scope of the Sullivan network came from an unexpected source. Among the surviving children was a girl named Rebecca, approximately 14 years old, who had been imprisoned longer than any of the others. Unlike many who had been broken by their ordeal, Rebecca retained a spark of defiance and an exceptional memory. Rebecca had been kidnapped from her family's farm in Pennsylvania in 1829, when she was only 9 years old. She remembered every detail of her abduction, how a woman claiming to be a distant relative arrived at the farm, how she was lured away with promises of sweets and a ride into town, and how she awoke chained in the Sullivan basement. More importantly, Rebecca remembered the conversations she overheard between Constance Sullivan and the many visitors who came to the farm over the years. Her testimony revealed that the Sullivan operation was only one part of a much larger network. She recalled discussions about other farms and locations where children were being held, along with names, dates, and details about shipments of children moved between facilities. Her information gave law enforcement their first comprehensive understanding of the scale of the operation. The most significant revelation came when Rebecca described a visit that occurred just 2 weeks before the discovery. A well-dressed man arrived at the farm in an expensive carriage, accompanied by 2 others. Rebecca and 3 additional children were selected for inspection. The man examined them closely, checking their teeth, muscle tone, and overall health, like a buyer evaluating livestock. In the end, he declined to purchase any of them, complaining that the children were too damaged for his purposes. However, he left behind a letter outlining detailed specifications for the type of children he wished to buy. The letter, discovered among Constance Sullivan's papers, listed requirements for children of particular ages, physical traits, and temperaments. Its tone was cold and transactional, treating human beings as goods to be bought and sold. The letter was signed H. Blackwood and included a return address in Charleston, South Carolina. When authorities investigated further, they learned that Henry Blackwood was a wealthy plantation owner who had been acquiring children for years, officially as household servants, but in reality for purposes that would prove even more disturbing than the Sullivan operation itself. The connection to Blackwood opened an entirely new dimension of the case. It appeared that Southern plantation owners had been using the child trafficking network to obtain workers who could be kept under total control. Unlike enslaved people, who had limited legal protections and whose disappearance might be noticed, trafficked children could be worked to death without consequence. They had no families searching for them, no legal standing, and no realistic chance of escape. The investigation into the Blackwood connection revealed that several other prominent Southern families had participated in similar purchases. These children were used not only for labor, but also for medical experimentation, violent entertainment, and other purposes so disturbing that investigators struggled to document them fully in official reports. As the scale of the criminal network became clear, the investigation encountered increasing resistance from powerful interests. Many of the families implicated had strong political connections and ample resources to shield themselves. Threats soon followed. Investigators, witnesses, and even surviving children were targeted. Sheriff Crawford received anonymous letters urging him to abandon the case. Deputy Webb was attacked by unknown assailants while walking home. Dr. Whitfield found his medical practice suddenly boycotted by influential patients. The intent was clear: to intimidate law enforcement and prevent the full exposure of the network. The danger escalated further when one of the surviving children, a boy named Timothy, who had been providing critical testimony, vanished from the temporary shelter where he was staying. A search was launched, but Timothy was never found. The message was unmistakable: those who cooperated with the investigation would suffer severe consequences. Despite the intimidation, the investigation pressed on. Federal marshals were assigned to provide additional protection for investigators and key witnesses. The surviving children were relocated to more secure facilities, and armed guards were stationed at the Sullivan farm to protect the evidence. The case had become a test of whether the American legal system could withstand crimes involving wealthy and influential offenders. The pressure reached its peak when Constance Sullivan was found dead in her jail cell. Her death was officially ruled a suicide, though the circumstances raised serious doubts. She had been scheduled to testify about the full scope of the network, including the identities of her contacts and customers. Her death removed the investigation's most critical witness and primary source of information about the broader conspiracy. Constance Sullivan's mysterious death sent shockwaves through the investigative team. If powerful interests were willing to eliminate key witnesses, no one involved was truly safe. The investigation had uncovered a criminal enterprise so vast and deeply connected that it threatened some of the most prominent families in the country. Just as the case seemed in danger of collapsing under intimidation and violence, an unexpected development shifted everything. A former employee of Henry Blackwood, driven by guilt over what he had witnessed, came forward with evidence that would unravel the entire operation. The man, Samuel Pierce, had worked as an overseer on the Blackwood plantation and possessed detailed knowledge of the children purchased through the Sullivan network. Pierce brought documents that confirmed the link between the Sullivan operation and Southern buyers. More importantly, he had first-hand knowledge of what happened to many of the children after they were sold to plantation owners. His testimony would provide the final pieces needed to expose the full horror inflicted on some of the most vulnerable children in America. Samuel Pierce's appearance before the federal grand jury in Richmond became one of the most disturbing testimonies in American legal history. In his 40s, with weathered hands and haunted eyes, Pierce had worked for Henry Blackwood for more than a decade. What he described, both about the Blackwood plantation and the fate of the Sullivan children, shocked even seasoned investigators who believed they understood the scope of the crimes. Pierce explained that the Blackwood plantation operated two distinct systems. The main plantation relied on enslaved labor for cotton production, following the brutal but common practices of Southern agriculture. Alongside it, however, Blackwood had created what Pierce called the experimental quarters, a separate facility where trafficked children were held for purposes unrelated to farming. The children purchased through the Sullivan network were used as subjects in medical experiments conducted by Blackwood and several associates, including 2 physicians from the Charleston Medical College. The experiments were intended to push the limits of human endurance, examine the effects of various drugs and treatments, and satisfy the scientific curiosity of men who viewed the children not as people, but as test subjects. Pierce's most incriminating testimony focused on the meticulous records Blackwood kept of these experiments. The plantation owner documented everything: the children's reactions to different procedures, their survival rates under varying conditions, and the progression of diseases that were intentionally introduced to observe their effects. The records made it clear that Blackwood and his associates were engaging in systematic torture under the guise of medical research. Pierce testified that at least 37 children from the Sullivan network had been sold to Blackwood over the years. Of those, only 4 survived long enough to be transferred to other buyers. The rest died as a result of experimentation, starvation, or the brutal conditions within the so-called experimental quarters. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves in a remote area of the plantation. Pierce also provided insight into the wider network of buyers. He had attended meetings where Blackwood discussed purchases with other plantation owners, wealthy businessmen, and even politicians. These conversations revealed that the trafficking operation extended far beyond what investigators had initially believed. Children were being bought and sold throughout the country, with buyers seeking victims that met specific needs and purposes. One of the most shocking disclosures came when Pierce described a gathering he witnessed in the fall of 1833. Blackwood hosted what he referred to as a demonstration for prospective buyers from across the South. The event was intended to display the quality of the children available through the network and to demonstrate the ways they could be used. Pierce's account was so disturbing that several members of the grand jury were forced to leave the room. The demonstration included displays of the children's ability to perform various types of labor, their responses to punishment and control, and their suitability for different forms of exploitation. Buyers were encouraged to examine the children closely, test their reactions, and place orders for specific types of victims. The entire event was conducted with the detached, transactional atmosphere of a livestock auction. Pierce's testimony also revealed the financial scale of the operation. Prices varied widely depending on a child's age, physical condition, and intended use. Younger children, who were easier to control and condition, commanded higher prices. Those with particular physical traits or abilities were sold at premium rates. The total value of the network was estimated in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, a vast fortune for the era. Using Pierce's information, investigators coordinated raids across multiple locations in the South. Federal marshals, working alongside local law enforcement, carried out simultaneous strikes on plantations, warehouses, and other facilities where trafficked children were being held. The operations were conducted in secrecy to prevent evidence from being destroyed and suspects from fleeing. The results were staggering. More than 100 additional children were rescued, and a wealth of physical evidence was seized, including financial records, correspondence, and detailed transaction logs. Several prominent figures were arrested, among them Henry Blackwood, 2 physicians from Charleston Medical College, and a Georgia state legislator who had been one of the network's most frequent customers. The evidence uncovered during the raids exposed a level of organized cruelty that shocked the nation. The trafficking network had operated for over 30 years, involved dozens of major buyers and sellers, and victimized hundreds of children. Its sophistication and scale were unprecedented for a criminal enterprise of that era. The medical experiments conducted by Blackwood and his associates were recorded in horrifying detail. The documents showed that children had been deliberately infected with diseases to study their progression, subjected to tests involving poisons and toxins, and operated on without anesthesia or proper medical training. The children were treated as disposable subjects, their lives valued only for the data extracted from their suffering. The investigation also exposed the corruption that allowed the network to exist. Officials at orphanages, poorhouses, and local governments had accepted bribes to supply children or ignore their disappearances. Judges were paid to declare children abandoned or to approve adoptions that were, in reality, sales. Some law enforcement officers were implicated in suppressing evidence and intimidating witnesses. The legal proceedings that followed stretched on for years as prosecutors struggled to pursue justice for crimes spanning multiple states and jurisdictions. The complexity of the case, combined with the wealth and political influence of many defendants, made convictions difficult. Several key figures avoided punishment through technicalities or powerful connections. Even so, the public exposure of the trafficking network had lasting consequences that reached far beyond the courtroom. The Sullivan case ultimately became a catalyst for the first federal legislation aimed at addressing child trafficking and abuse. It resulted in reforms to the oversight of orphanages and poorhouses and led to the creation of new legal protections for vulnerable children. Although the Sullivan case took nearly 5 years to reach its final resolution, its effect on American society was immediate and far-reaching. Public reaction combined horror with a strong resolve to ensure such atrocities would never occur again. Newspapers nationwide covered the revelations in unprecedented depth, with many dedicating entire editions to the investigation's findings. For the surviving children, recovery was long and painful. Most had been held for years and had no memory of life before their captivity. The 47 children rescued from the Sullivan basement required extensive medical care, psychological treatment, and careful assistance to relearn normal human interaction. Many never fully recovered, carrying lifelong physical and emotional scars. Rebecca, the 14-year-old girl whose testimony played a critical role in exposing the broader network, became widely known as news of her bravery spread. The attention, however, proved overwhelming for someone who had endured such trauma. She was eventually placed with a Quaker family in Pennsylvania, where she received the quiet support she needed to heal. Rebecca lived to the age of 73, later marrying and raising a family, but she never again spoke publicly about her experiences after her courtroom testimony. The legal proceedings exposed the full scope of the corruption that had allowed the trafficking network to operate. Ezra Sullivan, captured during the initial raid, was convicted on multiple counts of kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and murder. He was executed by hanging in Richmond on November 15, 1836, before a crowd exceeding 3,000 people. Witnesses reported that his final words included a confession of following a path of evil and a plea for forgiveness from the children he had helped torture. Henry Blackwood's trial drew widespread attention and revealed the dark realities of Southern plantation society. Medical records seized from his property documented systematic torture and murder, shocking even hardened observers. Blackwood was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death, but appeals and political maneuvering delayed his execution for years. He ultimately died in prison in 1841, reportedly from a heart attack, though some suspected he had been poisoned by associates afraid he might reveal further secrets. The 2 physicians from Charleston Medical College involved in the experiments were expelled from the medical profession and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. Their cases prompted new regulations governing medical research and the treatment of human subjects. The medical college itself was nearly shut down after investigators revealed that several faculty members had known about the illegal experiments and failed to report them. One of the most frustrating outcomes of the investigation was the number of powerful individuals who avoided accountability despite clear evidence of involvement. Several wealthy plantation owners fled to Europe before arrests could be made. Others relied on political influence to evade prosecution or receive minimal sentences that failed to reflect the gravity of their crimes. A Georgia state legislator, one of the network's major customers, was formally censured but never criminally charged. Financial investigations showed that the trafficking network generated enormous profits. Constance Sullivan alone accumulated more than $12,000 over her 20-year operation, an amount equivalent to several $100,000 today. Much of this money was never recovered, having been invested in legitimate businesses or hidden in accounts investigators could not trace. The Sullivan farm became a lasting symbol of the crimes uncovered. The government seized the property and later sold it at auction, though no one wished to live in a place associated with such atrocities. The house was demolished in 1845, and the basement was filled with concrete and permanently sealed. A small cemetery was established on the site to honor the children who died there, though most of their names remain unknown. The case brought about major reforms in child welfare and protection. Virginia enacted the first comprehensive child protection laws in American history, introducing government oversight of orphanages and requiring background checks for individuals seeking to adopt or care for large numbers of children. Other states soon passed similar laws, laying the groundwork for modern child welfare systems. The federal government also responded with legislation addressing interstate crime and human trafficking. The Sullivan case exposed the weaknesses of state-based law enforcement when confronting crimes that crossed borders. New federal statutes expanded the authority of marshals to investigate and prosecute trafficking cases, setting precedents that would shape future criminal justice efforts. Above all, the case permanently altered public awareness of children's vulnerability and the necessity of systematic protection. The idealized image of a benevolent individual caring for orphaned children was replaced by a more grounded understanding of the necessity for institutional oversight and legal protections. The expression, "another Sullivan case," entered common language as a warning about the risk of abuse in situations involving vulnerable children. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the physician who had unknowingly supported the Sullivan operation through his medical consultations, devoted the remainder of his career to child welfare. He founded free clinics for orphaned and abandoned children and became an advocate for reforms in medical practice aimed at preventing doctors from being exploited by criminals. His later writings on medical ethics were deeply shaped by his involvement in the Sullivan case. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, who led the initial investigation, was promoted to federal marshal and spent the rest of his career pursuing similar cases. He became one of the earliest law enforcement officials to specialize in crimes against children, developing investigative methods that would be used for decades. His detailed reports on the Sullivan case became required reading for law enforcement officers nationwide. As the children's stories emerged over the years, they revealed both extraordinary resilience and the lasting consequences of systematic abuse. Some, like Rebecca, were able to build relatively stable lives with proper care and support. Others struggled with mental illness, addiction, and related issues stemming from their traumatic experiences. A few never recovered, dying young from complications tied to years of confinement and mistreatment. Correspondence from the trafficking network, preserved as evidence, continued to provide investigators with leads long after the initial discovery. Letters found in the Sullivan basement referenced other operations, victims, and perpetrators. Some of these leads resulted in successful prosecutions, while others ended in dead ends or cases where too much time had passed to secure sufficient evidence. One of the most haunting realizations was that the Sullivan operation was only one part of a much larger system of exploitation that had operated largely unnoticed for decades. Investigators learned that similar networks had existed in other regions, that children had been treated as commodities throughout American history, and that legal and social systems had often failed to protect society's most vulnerable members. The case also underscored the importance of community responsibility in preventing such atrocities. Residents of Millbrook, who had lived for 20 years beside one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history, struggled with guilt and self-reflection. How had they missed what was happening? What signs had they overlooked or dismissed? Could the suffering have been prevented through greater vigilance or skepticism? These questions sparked broader discussions about the duty of communities to protect their most vulnerable. The Sullivan case became a warning against accepting explanations without scrutiny, respecting privacy when it enables abuse, and assuming that respectable appearances guarantee moral behavior. Its legacy extended far beyond the immediate legal and social reforms it inspired. The extensive documentation of the investigation, including correspondence, financial records, and testimony, became an invaluable resource for understanding the history of crime and exploitation in America. Historians, criminologists, and social reformers would study the case for generations to understand how systematic evil could thrive within seemingly ordinary communities. Ultimately, the Sullivan family's reign of terror ended not through advanced investigative techniques, but through the courage of ordinary individuals who refused to ignore clear signs of wrongdoing. William Hutchinson's decision to report what he heard, Sheriff Crawford's willingness to take community concerns seriously, and Rebecca's resolve to testify despite her trauma were the acts of moral courage that exposed one of the most horrific criminal enterprises in American history. The basement where 47 children were found chained has been sealed for more than a century, but the memory of their suffering remains a powerful reminder of the need for vigilance, courage, and compassion in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The Sullivan case stands as both evidence of human cruelty and a testament to the power of individual conscience to challenge even deeply entrenched systems of exploitation and abuse. If this story has sent a chill down your spine, it underscores why these dark chapters of American history must never be forgotten. The horrors uncovered at places like the Sullivan farm deepen our understanding of how evil can hide behind respectable facades. If this story affected you, share it with someone who appreciates dark mysteries. Support the content and stay engaged for more stories like this. Together, we can continue uncovering the secrets buried in America's past.